Uh, Good afternoon. My name is Rick Fouad. I'm an attorney and a member of the Hannah Arendt Center board. I'm also something of an accidental activist in the area of child welfare and charitable trust reform, which I only mention because it gives me a little experience with trying to organize in the area of civic relations, and I think this is on the agenda for today. I have to confess, if it's not apparent already, that the thought of introducing today's speaker struck me as being quite daunting, and I sought out a mentor, and I told him about this, and I said I feel like a remedial math student called on to introduce a global mathematician at a conference of leading scientists, and I said the only thing I know for sure is that it will end badly, and my only hope is that the laughter will be muffled. And my mentor friend told me, don't worry, just remember three things. One, say something funny. And I said, introducing Ralph Nader at a Hannah Arendt conference. I'm not exactly Chris Rock, although I am often told we look exactly alike. The second comment was, keep it short, and I said, I will try to get off stage so fast the Rhinebeck police will probably ticket me. And the third thing he said was, and he lowered his voice, just don't praise Ralph as a visionary. It'll upset people who hold him accountable for 8 years of George Bush, two wars, and the policies that led to the economic collapse.
That's my old yeah.
And I said, what about global warming and sunspots? And I thought we went from comedy to central to portraits of courage very quickly. I would like to return to that question of Ralph as a visionary and whether it's even impertinent for me to venture an opinion. And to do that, I simply want to remind us why we're here at a Hannah Arendt conference and why is Ralph Nader speaking to us on the topic of today. Sir Isaac Newton is not remembered because he created gravity, but because he articulated the formula by which we understand its properties, 32 feet per second squared. So too, Albert Einstein did not create quantum physics. He turned his powers of observation to the subject and articulated the magnificent formulae by which we understand it. There is a physics of human affairs and politics and history and action and activity and labor, and its Nobel laureate was Hannah Arendt, and she painted a veritable Sistine Chapel of formulae by which we're able to understand what might otherwise totally mystify us, the way that gravity mystified people before Sir Isaac Newton came along. And you cannot contemplate the concept of totalitarianism without reading the origins of totalitarianism. And you can't think about the machinery, the Nazi machinery of death without reading Eichmann in Jerusalem. As a young student after college, dazed and confused, I read Arendt's work on the U.S. Constitution, which Justice Brennan described as a masterpiece. And it inspired me to go to law school because I realized that my own view was David didn't slay Goliath with a slingshot, he slew him with a law degree. And I'd like to return to that. And my point is that wherever you look in the realm of human affairs, Hannah Arendt really blazed a path for us. And I think that, my opinions aside, framing our talk today in Arendtian terms, our speaker, in my view, Professor Arendt, would have, clapped her hands wunderbar and talked about Ralph Nader as a force of human nature, if I may. A man who, in my view, epitomizes the ideals of Arendt. And there are so many things that we can draw on to the prisms of Arendt to look at Ralph, but I would just take three. And one is this concept of action. The second is saying what is. And the third is amoris mundi. And so remember from yesterday what we talked about with action, great words, great deeds and great words. And the idea of originating and starting something. So no one needs to be reminded here that Ralph Nader started a revolution in consumer protection, in civic mindedness. I can't even begin to look at the number of organizations that he founded, but people know of them, I'm sure. The Center for Study of Responsive Law, the Citizen Advocacy Center, the Consumer Task Force. If you just look at the breadth of subjects, the National Citizens Coalition for Nursing Home Reform, and on in every area, Arendt talked about action and men and women entering the field of human affairs, and the fact that people can start something, and this is the miracle that we talked about yesterday. Great words and great deeds and great words, because we forget. We underappreciate talk today, but Arendt pointed out that sometimes an expression is enough to change everything, and when you think about it, Unsafe at Any Speed, I think, was a 60-page book, and all you need to do is walk into the parking lot and see what kind of a revolutionary change this triggered. The second area that Arendt admonished us about was saying what is, speaking truth to power. The idea of a public space built on facts and not nonsense. Every time I've ever seen Ralph Nader speak, it's always factual based. I remember the first impression I had was the ring binder, and someone would ask a question and he would turn to the part of his book where the facts were laid out. And my point is that in an Arendtian sense, Ralph Nader has always conducted himself in the highest ideals that Arendt described, which was a public space that's built on fact and reason and discussion and dialogue, and not agendas and obscuring of facts. The third area, and I'm trying to remember the second admonition of my friend, which was keep it short, is the idea of amoris mundi and love of the world. And so what does that mean, and what did that mean in an Arendtian sense? And what do I think about when I think about our speaker today? Arendt warned of the politics of disrepair, the destruction of the public space, the denial of the ability to act and to speak. And she said that we deny ourselves our humanity when we're not able to speak. And we look out there today and at the politics of today, and what are we reduced to? We have parties that basically don't listen. And if you look at the Tea Party movement, like it or not, or Occupy Wall Street, like it or not, what do you see but an angry reaction to the boxing out of dissenting voices? And Arendt talked about that. And so what do we see in Ralph Nader's writing and in his career? We see somebody who has paid attention to that and, in my humble opinion, tried to build the idea of a civic center, of a citizen activism, of involving people in the process of empowering them. And it would be almost reductionist to say that Ralph Nader matters. If I may say, he would probably admonish me that everyone matters, and every vote matters, and every voice should be heard, and we should stop boxing people out of the system. And this, to me, is the amoris mundi, the building of a better world that we want to preserve for future generations. I think that most of us, in terms of the political realm, go through life like ping pong balls in a hurricane. We observe the parties. The so-called champion of the people tells us, we can be heard if we can pony up the $10,000 to attend one of the dinners, or what to me is more embarrassing, buy a lottery ticket and be given a chance to have dinner with the president. And I look at that and I think, my goodness, is this what we've been reduced to? And I submit to you, and now returning to the question of visionary, and it's almost impertinent for me to say, is it my role? But I submit that our speaker, like Hannah Arendt would have admonished, is a visionary and is our David against their Goliath, and he is the champion of those ping pong balls in the hurricane and of wanting every voice to be heard and every vote to count and citizens to be empowered and to be brought into the public space. And I will simply close by reading from Hannah Arendt. And again, I was reading a lot to try to think, what is it that I thought captured this best, the topic of the conference and our speaker today. She said, power is actualized. Remember, she talks about power and people acting together and in concert. Power is actualized only where word and deed have not parted company, where words are not empty and deeds are not brutal, where words are not used to veil intentions, but to disclose realities, and deeds are not used to destroy, but to establish relations and create new realities. And I submit that our speaker today epitomizes those Arendtian ideals and has devoted his entire life to building and preserving a better world in the sense of Amoris Mundi. Without further ado, it's my humble honor to introduce today's speaker, Citizen Ralph Nader.
Thank you very much, Rick. Your appetizer turned into an entree. Thank Roger Berkowitz and Jonathan Becker, who's going to guide the discussion. Thank you for giving me such a minor, insignificant title to my address. Does the President matter? It's deliberately provocative. There isn't time to delve into the various permutations. So some of my comments will be seen as conclusions, but rest assured they can be backed up. We do want to have a discussion. In terms of further elaboration, I'm going to leave it at your library. This is the story of the 2000 campaign, which is a perfect example of how millions of people in a state of political servitude turn into masochists against anybody who wants to challenge a two-party trap, a two-party system. And that's the saddest part of the 2000 election, in the sense that the massive majority of the people are in the two-party trap. Half of them stay home, the rest grumble, vote hereditarily, or vote for the least worst, and then turn on anybody who is other than a two-party candidate, as if those people were second-class citizens. And so you hear words like spoiler, taking votes away. Who takes votes away? All candidates take votes away. They're either all spoilers of one another, or none of them are spoilers, if we all have an equal right to run for election, which I assume is a presumption here in our country. Then this is the enormous barriers to a competitive democracy. It's by my campaign manager, Teresa Amato, who's called Grand Illusion, the Myth of Voter Choice and the Two-Party Tyranny. A democracy is not a democracy if it's not competitive. And if a two-party duopoly block in dozens of ways, from ballot access laws to debates, from harassment and petitions to floods of baseless litigation against their small party challengers, that is not a democracy. That is not voter choice. Candidates getting on the ballot give choice to voters. And without candidates on the ballot, the voters' power is not what it should be. And money takes more and more preeminence. Now, in terms of does the president matter, obviously we can cut that subject in many dimensions. One interesting definition of a president was conducted by James McGregor Burns, when he said there are basically two kinds of presidents in our history: transformational presidents and transactional presidents. And we probably have the usual choices for transformational presidents. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is considered a transformational president. Everything's relative, by the way, in a massively corporatist society. And someone like Warren Harding or Coolidge or a variety of others are considered transactional. In our generation, it's hard to see a transformational president. They're very transactional. That reflects their personality and their character. Heraclitus, the ancient philosopher, once said character is destiny, and I would add that personality is decisive. If you are conflict averse, you're not going to be a transformational president. If you are indentured to commercial or other specific interests, you're not going to be a transformational president. If you have a low expectation level of your role and that of your citizenry for whom you are the president, you're not going to be a transformational president. So the trend is repeated series of transactional presidents bouncing off the lowest public expectation level I have ever seen in the last two generations. The base of the problem in the presidency is in the minds of millions of people who have given up on themselves, who have allowed their power, their sovereign power under the Constitution, to be delegated, misused, manipulated, and often turned against them directly. The Constitution starts with the phrase, "we the people." It does not start with the phrase, "we the corporation." And yet, the corporate sovereignty is dominant over popular sovereignty. It has turned our government into an accounts receivable for their grasping lobbyists, and it's basically become a corporate state. Exactly what Franklin Delano Roosevelt warned about in 1938 when he sent a message to the Congress to initiate a commission to investigate concentrated corporate power called the TNEC, the Temporary National Economic Commission. He said, whenever government is controlled by private economic power, that's fascism. That's the exact words he used. Young people should never forget, fascism is not only defined by Hitler and Mussolini. It's a system of government that's controlled by corporate power, as we have seen increasingly with corporate subsidies, handouts, giveaways, all under the executive branch, transcending parties and whoever is president. It doesn't matter. I debated once Ronald Reagan before he became president, and I couldn't wait to ask him the question, Mr. Reagan, what is your view on corporate welfare? He said, well, I go around the country and I talk to my business friends and I tell them, why are you putting your hand in the public trough in Washington? And I said to myself, this is really great, because I knew he was going to try again for the presidency. This is great. We've got an ideologically firm candidate against the transfer of public assets and public taxpayer money from the people to fewer and fewer giant corporations. And when he got into office, he didn't change anything. He didn't get rid of corporate welfare in any major category, and in some categories they were expanded. He did talk about it, but as Hannah Arendt said, there's a big difference between the word and the deed. Now, we're seeing this presidential campaign with the usual demeaning, impoverished dialogue between the major candidates and their vice presidential allies. Whenever I hear them, I say to myself, is it a third grade class that they're talking to? Maybe a second grade class that they're talking to? How can people not feel insulted when they hear this kind of rhetoric? When they see that the words are polished for manipulation, for deception, for dissembling. Politicians, for the most part, with few exceptions, engage in 4 F's. They engage in flattery. Show me a politician that doesn't flatter the people, and I'll show you a visiting Martian. They engage in fibs. They engage in fooling people, and they engage in flummoxing them, confusing them. 4 F's. If you look at the state of politics today, look in the mirror. See how many people don't vote. See how many people don't do any homework who do vote. See how many people who vote precisely because their grandparents were Republican or Democrats, hereditary voters. See how many people who have an extremely low expectation of what they expect of the presidency and the Congress. See people who are well-intentioned, people who have fine sense of justice, people who have allowed 535 men and women in Congress and a couple in the executive branch to take their power, give it to corporate interests, or turn it against their own people. As a result, we have the richest country in the world. How many times have we heard that? With half of the people living in poverty. Half of the people in this country are in poverty. The Department of Labor standard is absurd. They define poverty as any family of 4 who makes $24,000 before deductions. You're not poor if you make $24,000 without deductions, never mind no health insurance, for a family of 4. If you take it to 40,000 for a family of 4, it's about half the country. We are an advanced third world country. We have tens of millions of people who have trouble getting through the day on the average in terms of adequate food. We have people who are not well housed, people who are homeless, people massively in debt, people who don't have jobs in the millions, people who are underemployed, people who have jobs worried that they're going to be outsourced by corporate U.S. chartered companies that have no allegiance to this country other than to control it or ship its jobs and industry to fascist and communist regimes overseas who know how to keep workers in their place at 70 cents an hour. All this is permitted by a self-definition of presidential power and its relation with Congress. All this permitted because there isn't a million of us with a couple thousand in each congressional district who are willing to work together in hundreds of volunteer hours and raise enough money to open up 2 offices with 2 full-time people in each office to represent an agenda that is supported by a majority of the American people. Is that too much to ask? Every congressional district has 650,000 people or so. Is it too much to ask 2,000 Congress watchers? Do you know any congressional district that doesn't have 2,000 bird watchers? Serious bird watchers? We have a Congress that has taken our power and either misused it and squandered it in terms of resources and tax revenue and public lands and public airwaves and all the things we own as a commonwealth that we never study about in high school or college, or they take the power and give it to the executive branch, abdicating their congressional responsibilities and duties, such as the exclusive authority to declare war, which they've given up to the president. So a good way to begin analyzing a presidential status is to distinguish between authority and power. Whenever you hear those two words, watch out because they're often confused. Presidential authority is rooted in law, Constitution, statutes, treaties, executive orders. Presidential power can be way beyond presidential authority, or way less than presidential authority. It's up to the president to decide, is the gap one way or is the gap the other way? Constitutionally, as you know, there's separation of powers to restrain the president and checks and balances to restrain the president. That's fairly clear in our Constitution. But what we don't know is the period in our history where citizens had the highest expectation of themselves as citizens was not after 1787. It was before 1787. It was before 1776. It was in that turbulent pre-Declaration of Independence period when the people began to reassert themselves, 80% of them farmers, and they had two declarations, and some of them quite formalized, like in the early Pennsylvania Constitution. One declaration was, it is up to the people to create their Constitution directly, not indirectly, not through delegated powers, directly. And it is up to the people to interpret that Constitution from time to time directly, not through the judiciary. They would have been appalled if they were given a crystal ball and told that 9 unelected justices of the Supreme Court could determine what their Constitution meant. Now think of that for an expectation level and compare that with today. Now mind you, these people achieved that level of awareness because they were provoked by King George III, among other things, and they had their own plutocracy that was forming in the cities like Philadelphia, New York, Boston. But these people also knew something. What Jefferson said again and again, that the ultimate repository for a just society is in the people themselves, which means they had to converse, they had to talk, they had to argue, they had to study, they had to agitate, they had to demonstrate. We would do well to study the pre-Declaration of Independence period in American history. There are 2 books out, one by a professor of law and later dean at Stanford Law School called The People Themselves. That's the title of the book. Stunning historical rendition of what it was like in those years. The People Themselves by Larry Kramer. And the other one was a little book called Here the People Rule by Professor Parker at Harvard Law School. The point Parker made was that the president, that our government has an affirmative duty to facilitate the political and civic energies of the people. More on that in a moment. What's important here is the system that was set up in 1787 was rigged. It was rigged against change, and it was rigged to service the people who had the most time and the most property interest to control it. And so you had a system that baffles countries with parliamentary systems. You have a system where someone who can come in second in the popular vote can become president of the United States. George W. Bush, because of the Electoral College. You have a system that can be blocked by Congress with requirements of supermajorities. You have a system later developed with a filibuster, where we have now a democratically controlled Senate, but a Republican-run Senate. You have a system where the House can block or the Senate can block. You have a system where they can agree and send it to the president, and it could be a veto. And if it isn't a veto, it could be a signing statement. And if it isn't a signing statement, it can be overruled by the judiciary. It's a system in a period in our history where we always talk about change and how fast things are occurring. Fast, fast, quicker, quicker. But we have an incredibly paralytic gridlock in Washington, D.C. And it's not just because of the personalities that are there. It's not just because of the money that's there. The system itself is designed to block change. And it was designed that way in that hot room in Philadelphia in 1787. Let's not idealize it excessively. It was first in the world in a number of ways, especially with the Bill of Rights, which was an afterthought. And the Declaration of Independence was early in the world. But talking about democracy where women didn't have the right to vote, and blacks were slaves, and Indians were genocided, is not exactly a consistent political philosophy for us to excessively revere years later. Now, the presidency was expanded enormously by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for obvious reasons. There was a severe depression, 25, 30% unemployment. The system was hanging by a thread, and the capitalists knew it. The capitalists were frightened, the corporate capitalists, the big guys, not the small business. They were frightened, they went to Washington, and they wanted it both ways. They wanted to be saved, but they also wanted to be preserved. In terms of their privileges. So they accused Franklin Delano Roosevelt of being a traitor to his class, because he's patrician, this part of the country, rich, and they thought he turned against them. But as he said, he saved them. Roosevelt said he saved capitalism. And he was right. The next step was the wars. Wars always concentrate more and more power in the hands of the presidency. We now have a situation, never before in American history, where the president is a law unto himself. President Obama in 2008 would go around the country saying nobody's above the law. When he was elected, he made sure that his predecessors who violated the law, they violated systemically, endemically, repeatedly, daily, in serious and brutal ways. Our Constitution, in terms of the war-making power, in terms of civil liberties. They violated international treaties which we initiated and signed on to, like the Geneva Conventions. They violated federal statutes like illegal snooping, wiretapping in the thousands. They arrested thousands of people, many of them Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, reminiscent of the Japanese American internment. They arrested him, threw him in jail without charges, indefinitely, and very often without lawyers. And Mr. Obama, who taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago Law School, said that he's looking forward, not backward. Well, there is a reason why he said that, which we didn't know at that time. It's because he was going to do roughly the same thing. And even worse. We have here a situation that is so appalling and it doesn't create protests and marches, with the exception of a handful of American citizens. We now have the Obama doctrine, not implied, explicit, who says that he can go anywhere in the world, kill anybody he thinks is a threat to the country, regardless whether it's imminent or just free speech, including American citizens. Now just think of that for a moment. What do you call someone who has the following powers in his hands? Prosecutor, judge, jury, executioner, and cover-upper. What's the one word that describes that role? No matter what position that person holds in a country that says it's a country subordinated to the rule of law, not to the rule of men. Nobody's above the law. The word is murderer. That is what we have allowed to occur in our executive branch. And it's happening every day as we speak. Drones, special forces, rogue allies, out of control. What's fascinating about this tragedy is that it can get worse, that the same people who brought us Iraq on a platform of lies, deceptions, cover-ups, false statements, all well documented now, even by some of George W. Bush's own people. They're beating the drums for Iran. And they're setting up China. How do you have an $800 billion executive military budget without a major enemy? Or a minor enemy, a criminal gang that you exaggerate and therefore overreact to, Al-Qaeda, and produce all kinds of diffusion of that gang into a dozen countries now, where they never were there. Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, North Africa, Pakistan, not just Afghanistan. And yet, we do not have any depth in our citizenry to stop the next drive to war, which is never fought by these warmongers, many of whom were draft dodgers during the Vietnam War, who supported the Vietnam War, but they wanted their friends to go and kill and die. The presidency is out of control in terms of military and foreign affairs. The Congress has abdicated its role. The perfect example of that is the attack on Libya. Never in American history has the following occurred. We attack a country that was not a threat to us. In fact, we were engaged in a rapprochement with the dictator. Obama attacked the country without a declaration of war, without a war resolution, without an authorization of funds, and without an appropriation of funds. He found $1 billion or so in the black budgets in the Pentagon. Now that's the role of a dictator, however consensual he might have been in the halls of Congress. That's how far it's gotten. Not even George Bush tried to pull that one. He always tried to get some sort of resolution. Now, if you think this is primarily an issue of how we're bullying and pushing around people, engaging in collateral damage and killing all kinds of innocent people with the press of a button from Virginia or Nevada via the drones, consider this. We now have a president who's taken upon himself the responsibility to decide who lives and who dies when the drones target. And so every Tuesday morning, with his advisors, he's basically told, we've got so-and-so suspect thousands of miles away. However, we can never see that suspect except in the company of other people. And you make the decision, and he makes the decision. One time there was a Pakistan Taliban. Okay, you don't like Pakistan Talibans? They're worried about Pakistan. They're trying to shove things around in Pakistan. Happens all over the world. He was on a roof. His wife was next to him. There were some family members. The head of the CIA didn't want to make the decision. Targeted by a drone. It's television now. Goes to the White House. What's the verdict? If we push the button, we blow up the family. President said, push the button. 12 boys getting firewood in Afghanistan on a hill, wiped out. Oh, sorry, mistake. 8 women and children last week. Now, this can be just seen as really bad military foreign policy. That we are basically getting what the CIA has called blowback in one area after another because of an out-of-control presidency. But it's more than that. We're banking a lot of revenge that may come back to haunt us in the coming years. These actions are not without a future of risk. Now, on the other hand, you have a president whose hands are tied. Congress reasserts itself. Say when the president would want something for health insurance, or want something for tax reform, or want something for stronger regulation and larger budgets for corporate crime, or better social services for poor and the needy, the Congress suddenly reasserts itself and can say no. And very few people have to say no. Think of this absurdity. December 2010, we had an auto safety bill to bring it up to date. It had the president's approval. It had the House approval under Nancy Pelosi. It was going through the Senate under unanimous consent. 99 senators gave unanimous consent. 1 senator did not. I called the senator up. His name was Senator Coburn from Oklahoma, a medical doctor. I said, what are your objections? Let me respond to your objections. He gave me 3 objections, one of which he doesn't want any bill that spends any more money. I said, this does not spend any more money. It deals with electronics and modern vehicles. It deals in stronger penalties for corporations who violate federal safety standards and so on. That didn't seem to matter. 1 senator under the rules killed that legislation. How can we not be ashamed of a system like that? And it happens again and again. They hold up judicial appointments. 1 senator. They hold up legislation. They hold up budgets. They hold up macro budgets for some little itty-bitty thing that 1 senator doesn't like. And because all the senators want to have the power of that 1 senator to block action, they will not change the system. They will not change the filibuster. So in that way, the president doesn't matter. The president is blocked by a system that is not democratic and it's not open. A lot of times that 1 senator who puts a hold, you don't know who that 1 senator's name is. So we have this paradox, an out-of-control president, because the Congress does not like to take responsibility for military and foreign policy, largely. And it gets worse. When both parties are aggressive, when both parties are warlike, there is no competition from anyone else, because there are no third parties. Because third parties are excluded, repressed by the whole system from ballot access to the debates. So you have this paradox that goes on. And the paradox is such that the restraints are still in law, but the powers that can stretch that authority and violate that authority have no political restraint by the people back home. because the politicians are still afraid of the people. But to be afraid of the people, in a creative sense, the people have to start a rumble. President Nixon signed into law great bills that he never believed in. He signed into law the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Product Safety Commission, the Environmental Protection Council in the White House. And he even wanted other good laws dealing with drug policy, rehabilitation instead of incarceration. He wanted people in the District of Columbia to have the vote for their members of Congress. Now, why would a right-wing Republican president do that? A short answer is he was the last president who was a Republican president who was afraid of liberals. A longer answer is that he heard the rumble from the people coming out of the 60s. And he was afraid. In other words, unlike today, where I can't get anybody in Congress to debate Senator Jim Inhofe, who thinks climate change and global warming are hoaxes, I can't get a Democrat to debate. He cannot wait to debate. It's as if the Democrats are ashamed now, from Obama to Congress, of highlighting an inflation-adjusted minimum wage for 30 million workers, which would go up to $10 an hour, catching up with 1968 minimum wage adjusted for inflation. They're afraid to talk about climate change. They're afraid to talk about the progressive agenda that their party was known for, however modestly, decades ago. Now, what was that rumble from the people? That rumble from the people was 1% of the citizenry. You heard a lot from Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, about the 1%, the richest, the oligarchs, plutocrats, Wall Street. How about the other 1%? All it takes is 1% of the citizenry rolling up their sleeves, organizing one another in congressional districts, because you turn Congress around, the most powerful branch under our Constitution by far, you can turn the rest of the government around. All it takes for that level of commitment of a couple thousand people in each congressional district. Every congressional district has colleges and community colleges. Every congressional district has a whole variety of people who are dutiful, sensible, have a sense of their trusteeship to posterity, and want to avoid living a trivial, agonized, frustrating life. But they don't connect with each other. And therefore, they seem to themselves to be powerless. Abraham Lincoln once said, with public sentiment, you can do anything. Without it, you can't do much of anything at all. And if those 2,000 people in each congressional district, with their volunteer hours and their full-time offices, can lead with a dozen long overdue changes in this country that we all know about, cracking down on corporate crime and power, living wage, full Medicare for all, a tax system that doesn't have the perverse and corrupt incentives, getting rid of the bloated military budget, putting the money back into building public works and repairing everything that needs to be repaired, clinics and schools and public transit and underground sewage and water systems. We know what needs to be done. These come in at 80% in the polls. Even the minimum wage, which has no champion in Washington, comes in at 70% in the latest Zogby poll. You can ask them. They're going to be here today. Even Rick Santorum and Romney are for a minimum wage adjusted inflation, which would take it up to $10 and pump tens of billions of dollars into enhanced consumer demand in a recessionary economy. But we've got to stop making excuses for ourselves. I come from a small New England town for which there should be no excuses. We have a town meeting and a town referendum. The people are sovereign. The precincts, the voting precincts are 2, 3, 4, 5 blocks away. 11,000 people. And yet people in that town feel powerless. They're cynical. It's the town hall. It's because they're making excuses for themselves. 4 excuses. Why aren't you an engaged citizen? 1, I don't have time. Oh, okay, you don't have time. You're a dropout from democracy. Put a little thing here. I belong to the Society of Apathetics. Okay? Okay, if you have time, what's your other excuse? Well, I don't know the details and the rules of order, and the lawyers will tell me to shut up at the city council meeting. Okay, that's pretty easy to learn. Do you know how to play video games? Yeah. You know how to play bridge? Yeah. Well, you can learn these rules for your town meeting. Okay, so you got time, you got the, you know how to do the rules. What's the further excuse? Well, could be retaliation, I could be smeared, attacked, might not get promoted in my job if I'm viewed as a troublemaker. Oh, boy, you're a brave person. This doesn't quite fit Hannah Arendt's definition of courage, does it? You're a really brave person. You're blistered by moonbeams. Grow up. This isn't Somalia. This isn't some broken down system where if you speak out, you go to some gulag. This is the United States of America. What's your 4th excuse? You got the time. You can learn the rules. You can stand tall. What's your 4th excuse? Here it comes. No rebuttal to this one. Well, if I did what you asked me to do and got engaged and was an active citizen, it wouldn't matter. You can't change anything. The big boys decide. So why should I waste my time? I could spend my time playing video games, looking at TV, having a good time in my spare time. Making excuses for ourselves is the beginning and the end of the decline of our society. It's a betrayal of our children and grandchildren. The ticket to civic activism is free. Now let me get it right down to the students. This young generation who is so busy walking along looking like this that they can't look at any of the horizons that they should be building. They're looking like this. They're text messaging, pumping music into their heads, hours and hours at a time, when they're not doing their studies. What if you had a course called Congress 101? And the course simply studied the contemporary 2 senators and representatives. Everything they do, day after day. And you feed it to the entire district. You live stream it. So you are the source of information to evaluate and hold accountable your 2 senators and representatives. And when you finish your course, guess what? You got another student body taking your place. It's the closest thing to eternity that you could get. They can't wear you out and they can't wear you down. Because if they wear you out, you got a fresh crop of students coming in. You will learn how to produce power out of knowledge and your ability to disseminate it. There are no excuses. 1 million people in this country reflecting the public sentiment, reflecting the golden rule, reflecting everything that is called fair play, that is always majority supported, and turn this country around. And have it truly be a beacon for the world, instead of a source of drones and napalm and anti-personnel weapons and nuclear subs and aircraft carriers, in a world where we have no major enemy anymore, but we have what Eisenhower warned about, an entrenched military-industrial complex. Finally, the president matters because of the bully pulpit. But the trouble is, we've had presidents with marbles in their mouths. They can't tell even what's on their mind. They're always self-censoring themselves. Censorship is facilitated by self-censorship, each and every one of us. With the bully pulpit, a president can engage in a two-track presidency. I wrote a column and gave it to Jimmy Carter in January 1977 on this. The first track is the usual things presidents do every day. I don't have to describe them. The second track is developing the facilities to make it easy for all of us to band together, whether as voters, insurance policyholders, bank depositors, buyers of automobiles, buyers of health care, easily band together into nonprofit advocacy groups. You wouldn't want to know where our environment would be without a handful of nonprofit environmental organizations in this country, or our civil liberties would be without the ACLU, or our civil rights would be without the NAACP. But we need thousands of more of these civic advocacy groups, national, regional, local, neighborhood. And as Professor Parker of Harvard said, it's an affirmative duty under the Constitution by the President and the Congress to facilitate the civic and political energies of the people. And there's a whole series of simple ways, inserts in your utility bills, your bank statements, online, inviting you to join and support full-time advocates so you can have a seat at the table with the corporations and the government regulators who are often so indentured, so that you can stop the process of giant corporations planning our future. The corporations, by their power in Washington and their power over us in the workplace and marketplace, these are the giants, the global corporations. They are planning our political future. Look at all the money. They are planning our governmental future. Look at the swarms of lobbyists. They are planning our food future. Look at the processed food. Look what they're doing to our food, counteracted by an increasing number of organic farmers and farmer-to-markets, fortunately, but not enough. They are planning our educational future, commercializing education. Not here at Bard College. Try some other universities and see how they're corporatized. Corporatized in terms of their research topics, corporatized in terms of their joint ventures with professors, corporatized in terms of utilizing grad students for that purpose, corporatizing and turning the universities into vocational schools, not just humanities or social science, no. Heavily vocational. That's okay, you want to become an accountant, you want to become a lawyer, but there's something more. The humanities and the social sciences increasingly being subordinated. These corporations are planning our foreign and military policy. What do you think the military-industrial complex is? You think Lockheed Martin can ever tell you enough is enough for weapon systems? Never. Enough is never enough. They're planning our genetic future. Cotton plantation companies used to have slaves. Now, the corporations have monopoly patents on our gene sequences. Thousands of them. Following the Supreme Court decision 5-4 in 1980. They're planning our electoral future. They're planning our agrarian future. Isn't it time for us to plan our own future? Because you're not dealing just with Monsanto and Exxon Mobil and Bank of America and Aetna. You're dealing with the combined power of corporations controlling government. I've often said we could always win against corporations in Washington if the corporations didn't own Washington. You can't win up against the corporate government. That's what we have to unlock. And so let me leave you with this message. Rick mentioned Hannah Arendt's connection between word and deed. There's an ancient Chinese saying, not so ancient, 14th century, to know and not to do is not to know. That's easy to remember. We got to remember that just having good thoughts and good ideas without applying them raises the very question as to whether we have good thoughts and good ideas. Knowledge for what? The second is the students have a great opportunity to use their independent work and their seminar work to etch their future career. I did a paper at Harvard Law School called Unsafe Automobile Design. I suppose General Motors would have liked an early look at that. Decide what you want to do in life by what you work on in college. Plenty of injustices. It's like fishing off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland in 1800. You can have your choice of injustice. Third, raise your expectation level. You're coming from a generation with an exceedingly low expectation level, and there are a lot of reasons for that. There's no time to go into. Expectation levels are key to reordering power in a more distributional and just sense. Too much power in too few hands deciding for the many. We have to change that. You change that by a higher expectation level that liberates your sense of indignation, that gives you fire in the belly so it connects with what you know in your mind. You know in your mind what's wrong. You need fire in the belly. The psychologists call it emotional intelligence. Okay, call it emotional intelligence. You need fire in your belly. The great changers in American history, they didn't just know something most people didn't know. They knew something most people knew. Whether it's Rosa Parks or the sit-down strikers in Flint, Michigan, forming the United Auto Workers. They had fire in their belly. Today's generation doesn't have enough fire in the belly. They give you a blank look. Lastly, make the distinction between participants and spectators. Presidential politics has become a spectator sport surrounded by theatrics. If it isn't a sport, it's theatrics. There's no reason why we don't invite the presidential candidates to presidential debates all over the country, that we summon the candidates to our cities and towns and rural areas, instead of letting a corporation created by the two parties called the Commission on Presidential Debates to decide who gets on and who doesn't, and who picks the reporters who ask the questions. What an absurdity. What a mockery. It's allowed because we have such a low expectation level that when you say to people, as we have in recent months in Portland, Oregon, and Pittsburgh, and District of Columbia, why don't you put a letter to the presidential candidates with all the citizen groups, business, labor, neighborhoods, nonprofit, civic, women's, children's, and say, we want a presidential debate. You come here. We're going to run it. They look at you like with a blank look. We can do that, you mean? Watch your expectation levels. Finally, get rid of this two-party system, which is the conduit for the corporate state by corporations who have learned to game the system to increase the convergence of the two-party duopoly and turn it into a tyranny and a business agent for fewer and fewer giant corporations who were chartered in the U.S., who grew to profits on the backs of American workers, who, when they got in trouble, went to Washington and were bailed out on the backs of American taxpayers, who, when they got in trouble overseas, were able to call on the U.S. Marines to save them. And what is their message to this country, filtered through the two-party duopoly? Is it one of gratitude to the American people? Or is their message, we're out of here, folks, with your jobs and your industries to fascist and communist regimes overseas? Freud liked to talk about guilt. Jung liked to talk about shame. I don't like guilt, but I think it's time that we used shame as a motivating factor. Shame on us. Cognition is not ignition. We got to get that emotional intelligence and expectation level up. Otherwise, whoever becomes president will become a prisoner in the White House of the corporate complex and will matter less and less because we've shaped it that way by making excuses for ourselves. Thank you.